Revelations about the Vatican's sanctions against Theodore McCarrick surfaced this week, and Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano has returned with words directed at Pope Francis. Former head of the Vatican Supreme Court and canon lawyer Cardinal Raymond Burke reacts from Rome. And how are these new revelations being received at the Vatican? Columnist and theologian George Weigel joins us with his analysis. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. A great show for you tonight. Cardinal Raymond Burke and George Weigel are straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. Lots to cover, but first, some news. Parliamentary elections in the EU this week saw nationalists gaining ground over long dominant centrist parties. Liberal and Green parties also made headway against the centrists, causing some to fear that populism and anti-immigrant sentiment is gaining ground in Europe, particularly in the UK, France, and Italy, where nationalists won the most seats at the EU. Pope Francis took the occasion to push back against populism by once again defending migration, saying, "The signs of meanness we see around us heighten our fear of the other, the foreigner," end quote. Here with his thoughts on this and more is the former head of the Vatican's highest court, the Apostolic Signatura, and one of the world's foremost canon lawyers. He is also one of the 4 cardinals who posed the dubia to Pope Francis regarding his Amoris Laetitia. Please welcome Cardinal Raymond Burke, who joins us from Rome. Your Eminence, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Raymond.
Look,
I'm pleased to be with you.
I want to start with the big story that broke this week. Leaked correspondence between former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, Pope Francis, and others seemed to confirm that there were restrictions placed on McCarrick in 2008 stemming from his sexual misdeeds, which were known by people in the Vatican and elsewhere. The correspondence also shows that McCarrick was instrumental in helping to broker the Vatican-China deal. The correspondence was leaked by a former aide of McCarrick, Monsignor Anthony Figueredo. Now, since these restrictions against McCarrick were in place since at least 2008, why were they not enforced, Your Eminence?
I do not know the answer to that question. These kind of restrictions, which obviously in such a case were of the most serious nature, should have been public in the sense they should have been known by all who would have had any dealings with Theodore McCarrick, and therefore permitting them to comply with the restrictions. And so I have not been able to figure out how these restrictions were in place,
right,
when it seems quite clear from a number of reliable sources that in fact they were not enforced. Mm-hmm. For that reason, I have been insisting for some time that there needs to be a thorough canonical investigation done according to the norms of canon law into the whole question of how Theodore McCarrick was able to carry on as he did, who was responsible for permitting that. Mm-hmm. I don't think that that's being done, and until we have such an investigation, people remain in wonderment, and it damages very much their trust in the church, and especially in the hierarchy. And the hierarchy is constitutive of the church. In other words, the church is governed by pastors according to the will of our Lord, and we desperately need to get this matter clear, and so that good Catholics can rightly have trust again.
Yeah. This Figueredo correspondence has been vetted by numerous reputable news outlets, CBS, Crux among them. Assuming these restrictions were in place, were they canonically binding? I mean, we have Cardinal Ray, who is then head of the Congregation for Bishops, apparently memorializing these restrictions in a letter to McCarrick and to Wuerl.
Well, such restrictions should have been put in place by a decree, by a canonical document of public record. And I don't know if such a decree was ever issued. But sadly, in the last decades, there has been a tremendous loss of respect for canonical discipline in general, and also for correct procedures. This is seen to be a sign of some new freedom in the Church, and what it results in is exactly in the kind of injustices which have resulted in the present case which we are discussing. No, I don't know what procedure was followed, but that needs to be investigated.
In an interview this week, the Pope claimed he knew nothing of the McCarrick situation. Now Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano has resurfaced, claiming the Pope is lying. Vigano told LifeSite, "What the Pope said about not knowing anything is a lie. He pretends not to remember what I told him about McCarrick, and he pretends that it wasn't him who asked me about McCarrick in the first place." Now, that is a meeting that supposedly took place in June 23rd of 2013. Your Eminence, my question is not whether the Pope is lying or not, because none of us can determine that, but what can be done if he were? If he were in fact lying, what can be done canonically? I mean, who is to correct him? Is there a canonical process for this sort of thing? Or is this just an academic consideration at this point?
No, the Pope, because of the authority which he has in the Church as the head of the Apostolic College, cannot be tried by anyone else. He's not subject to that kind of action. But the faithful, including cardinals and bishops and priests, all have the right to express to the Holy Father their concern in the matter and to have a response from him. And I think that this is what is needed, is a response from the Holy Father to the question. Sadly, all of these matters are being treated through interviews and with many doubts about language and so forth, and what was actually meant. And I believe that there needs to be a concise, direct, and eminently clear declaration in the matter.
How do you think McCarrick was permitted, Cardinal Burke, to globetrot and negotiate deals like this China Pact, given the obvious knowledge of his crimes? Now we have more evidence through these leak correspondence, through the Vigano testimony, that there was knowledge at many levels. Even Cardinal Wuerl, now the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Bishops, he admitted in the letter he released last year that there was knowledge of this. In 2008, they have documentation. How was he allowed in the reign of Francis to go off and globetrot and negotiate on behalf of the Church?
Precisely because canonical discipline was not followed. Precisely because in some way, I don't know how, because I don't have access to the documentation, but in some way, individuals put themselves above the good discipline of the Church, and now we have this situation on our hands, which is frankly a scandal.
Yeah.
A scandal to me and a scandal to so many others.
Sure, and to say nothing of the victims involved here, seminarians, boys, men now, who were abused in the process.
Yeah,
Your Eminence, should the Vatican release, I know you're calling for a canonical investigation of what happened here and how McCarrick rose through the ranks. Should the Vatican release a report or make public its findings regarding this McCarrick case? They've already said that they would scour the documents to figure this out. We obviously do not have all the documents yet.
It has been said that this is being done. I trust that it is being done, but I think that in such a situation in which there has been such a loss of trust, and for good reason, that the Holy See needs to let people know how this investigation is proceeding, and in fact that it is proceeding, and then that those who who took part in any way failed to exercise their responsibility to observe the restrictions on the ministry of Theodore McCarrick, those people have to accept the consequences of their actions. They can't. There has to be a sanction for this kind of gross betrayal of trust in order to reestablish a just order in the church.
Yeah.
People see, well, we have to be forgiving. Of course we have to be forgiving, but forgiveness and mercy is postulated first on justice, on a just acknowledgement of what has happened, and on a correct action to rectify the injustice. And we leave the rest in the hands of God, but we have to do our part.
I must also ask you about this case of Archbishop Gustavo Sanchita. Now, he is the Argentine bishop who was charged with sexual malfeasance of seminarians, having porn on his phone, financial improprieties. The Pope, in a new interview, says he sent Sanchita to treatment in Spain. Later, he asked him to resign from the diocese in Argentina, and he brought him to the Vatican. Now he says he's open to canonical investigation of Sanchita. My question is, what took so long? And why give a man like this, charged with these, misdeeds to crimes, a Vatican job where he's overseeing church property?
Yes, this is incomprehensible. To get back to my point, and I don't mean to be annoying, but what should have happened in the first place is that the minute these accusations were made, which were very serious, the canonical investigation should have taken place then. Yes, it's good for such a man to be sent for treatment and so forth, but at the same time, because of the grave misdeeds to the harm of souls, especially of seminarians and others who should be able to put their trust in their bishop, that should have been addressed from day one.
Yeah. The EU Parliament, I want to move to this. This is a big topic that we're seeing internationally. The EU Parliament elections this week saw major gains for populists across Europe, especially Farage's party in the UK, Salvini in Italy. Pope Francis has been very critical of populism before and after the EU elections. The former head of the CDF, Cardinal Gerhard Mueller, had some thoughts on the Pope's view of populism. He said this week, "A church authority cannot speak in such an amateur way about theological questions, and especially it must not intrude into politics when there is a democratically legitimized parliament and government as there is in Italy. It's better to talk with Salvini, discuss or correct him when necessary. It's curious that the Pope has received the most secularist people and not Salvini. He dialogues with the Venezuelan regime or with China, which places millions of Christians in re-education camps, destroys churches, persecutes Christians." End quote. Your Eminence, is Mueller correct here? Is the Pope inserting himself into a political debate rather than engaging as a shepherd with these political figures that perhaps he could win over in a different way?
Yes, we have to take our direction here from what has been the constant practice of the Church, following our Lord's own words, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God what is God's." And the Church is never right to mix itself directly into political action, while at the same time, in order to carry out her mission, she has to pronounce herself with regard to moral questions of politics. In other words, when politics are offending against the dignity of the human person, or against the fundamental right to life, or against the integrity of marriage, or whatever it may be, the Church has to speak out, and that's our role. With regard to this whole question of populism, patriotism is in fact part of the natural moral law. It's in the fourth commandment that we owe. The first three commandments are reverence to God. Then the rest of the commandments begin with the reverence we owe to our parents, to our family, and to our homeland, in which a family is able to exist and to grow and develop. And this has always been part of the teaching of the Church. You will also find it in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. This is this kind of, and then to use the word nationalism, which is a red flag word, it conjures up thoughts of the abuse of the loyalty to one's homeland for some kind of totalitarian purpose. But there is a genuine patriotism which requires, for instance, with regard to the question of immigration, which requires a nation to, yes, we have to take in those who are real refugees, those who have nowhere to go. But on the other hand, the church has never taught that a nation should engage in indiscriminate immigration, which is neither good for the nation itself to the extent that it may not be able to handle all of those who are migrating, and at the same time, it's not good for the nation of origin of all of those who are leaving their homeland when they should be staying there to devote themselves to their homeland. And the only reason given when we must accept someone who comes to our borders is that they aren't able to have a livelihood in their homeland. They're not able to have in their homeland those things which they need to live. And so this is, but these are very delicate questions, and we need to dialogue with Vice Premier Matteo Savini, with others, about this question.
Your Eminence, you yourself came under fire for comments regarding the regulation of Muslim immigration when you said not long ago, Muslims have said that they are able today to accomplish what they were not able to accomplish in the past with armaments because Christians no longer are ready to defend their faith, what they believe. They are no longer ready to defend the moral law. Limiting large-scale immigration, Muslim immigration, is in fact, as far as I'm concerned, a responsible exercise of one's patriotism. Why did you say that? Your critics are saying you're broad-brushing an entire population of people.
No, I'm not at all. And I'm not an Islamophobe. I respect Islam for what it is. But I'm saying to my fellow countrymen and to other people of goodwill, you must recognize and respect Islam for what it is. And Islam is a form of government. And you can ask the most specific Muslim who's living in any country, if you ask him, when you become a majority of the population, must you impose Sharia, the Islamic law, on the whole nation? And if he's a true Muslim, he'll have to tell you yes, because that's the nature of the religion. I don't say this to stir up hatred or negative reaction to Muslims, but simply to say we need to recognize Islam for what it is, to respect its integrity. And so if a nation indiscriminately welcomes so many Muslims who are also going to have children, many children, which is a good thing. I very much respect the love for the family in Islam. They will become the majority of the population, and at that moment they will be obliged by their religious faith. They will be obliged to impose that government on the whole population and Sharia, that law. That's all I'm saying. But people, everybody wants to right away get involved in accusations, you're a racist, you're an Islamophobe, and so forth. I'm just asking, let's be reasonable about this, and let's talk to each other in a reasonable way.
Your Eminence, Pope Francis regularly says that it's imperative to follow the biblical command of welcoming the stranger. This week, in that Mexican interview, he chimed in again on U.S. immigration policy and the Trump wall. He said this: "We knew of one, of Berlin, and the many headaches and sufferings it caused us. But it appears that man does what animals don't, right? Man is the only animal that falls twice into the same hole, right? We are returning to the same thing, right? Building walls as if it were a defense, right? Defense is dialogue, growth, acceptance, and education, integration." Your Eminence, is a wall on a border immoral?
No, not at all. a wall on a border could serve some very good function to keep good order between two sovereign states, which is the case of Mexico and the United States. Here we're not talking about a totalitarian regime as was the case with the building of the Berlin Wall. They're two distinct cases. And whether you agree or do not agree that a wall is the best way to do it, the wall can legitimately represent a way of carrying out responsible immigration. And that's to say I don't agree that it's an inherently immoral act to put up a wall.
Back here in the United States, the California State Senate has proposed a bill, Your Eminence, that would force priests to report cases of abuse, even if they hear those cases or of those cases in the confessional. Now, this would, of course, violate the sacred seal of confession. How serious a canonical crime is it for a priest to reveal anything heard in confession? Cardinal Burke.
It's among the most serious canonical delicts, and a priest may not, under any circumstance, reveal what knowledge it is received during the hearing of a confession. And if the government in California insists on this, they'll have every priest, every good priest in California will be in jail. Because the priest cannot, as St. Peter said, we must obey God before we obey men. In order to be good citizens, to do our duty as citizens, we must first respect the law of God. And confession is a communication between the penitent and God. The priest is the mediator of that communication, but because it is a confession before God, the priest may not in any way reveal that what he's learned in confession.
The California legislature, they conscripted this law in an amendment, and they said, well, you would only have to reveal information that you gathered from a priest or a bishop whose confession you were hearing. Would you comply with that law?
Doesn't matter whose confession you're hearing. Confession is confession, whether you're hearing a priest's confession, a bishop's confession, confession of a member of the lay faithful. It's confession, and it's sacrosanct. It's of God.
Yeah. Finally, before I let you go, there are reports that Professor John Rist, he's an esteemed professor, he's taught at many Catholic institutions, and he was a signatory of that letter that charged the Pope with heresy. Apparently, he has now been sanctioned. He was a visiting professor at the Augustinium in Rome. He has been barred from entering any pontifical university, including CUA here in D.C., which has apparently canceled publication of a book of his essays. Your reaction to this? What's going on here?
Well, once again, from what I've read, and that's all I know, there's been no public document of the restriction. What is it? And what is the reason for the restriction? We seem to, in the Church, have fallen into a kind of a totalitarian mentality where people are simply exercising authority without speaking with the person involved. From what I read, no one explained to Professor Rist why he was no longer permitted to leave his automobile at the Augustinianum, and why he was now no longer able to direct a doctoral dissertation. This should be something that he's spoken with. Professor Rist and his wife Anna are devout Catholics. They're both very learned people who have placed their considerable learning at the service of the Church, and to treat esteemed members of the faithful in this way, I find completely unacceptable.
Well, unlike the McCarrick sanctions, I guess there are some sanctions that stick and that are enforced, whether there's a canonical decree or not. Cardinal Raymond Burke, I thank you so much for being here. We will catch up with you in the days ahead.
Good. Thank you, Raymond.
You can follow Cardinal Raymond Burke on Twitter at Cardinal R. Burke, or visit his website, cardinalburke.com. As I discussed with Cardinal Burke, the correspondence published on Tuesday by Monsignor Anthony Figueredo, former personal secretary to the former disgraced Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, confirms that Pope Benedict imposed some sort of restrictions on McCarrick and that Cardinal Wuerl may have known of those restrictions, in spite of claims to the contrary. The correspondence also proves that McCarrick ignored those restrictions. Here with more analysis is theologian, columnist, and author of The Fragility of Order and the forthcoming The Irony of Modern Catholic History. Welcome, George Weigel, back to the program.
Thank you, Raymond.
Great to see you. I want to start with this August 25th, 2008 letter from McCarrick to the then papal nuncio, Archbishop Pietro Sambi, that reveals that McCarrick's acknowledgement of the restrictions imposed on him. He wrote, having studied the letter of Cardinal Ray, the then head of the Congregation for Bishops, and having shared it with my Archbishop, Wuerl, I pledge again that I shall always try to be a good servant of the Church, even if I do not understand its desires in my life. Of course, I'm ready to accept the Holy Father's will in my regard. I could find a place to live at one of the parishes in the Archdiocese of Washington. The Archbishop is willing to arrange for that in any area that the Holy See would desire. In summary, in the future, I will make no commitments to accept any public appearances or talks without the express permission of the Apostolic Nuncio or the Holy See itself. Seems as if there's evidence in Rome or in the Nuncio files in D.C., George, that restrictions were in place. Does this vindicate Vigano, who made these charges that Wuerl's known all along?
It certainly vindicates Archbishop Vigano's claim that Benedict XVI, presumably having been informed of some very bad problems with then Cardinal McCarrick, essentially told him to shut down. Let's also remember that it was Benedict XVI who rather quickly after his election accepted the pro forma resignation that Cardinal McCarrick had submitted, but manifestly did not expect to be accepted for at least several years. What we have here, I'm afraid, is a lack of disciplinary follow-up. That letter you just quoted, for those of us who knew Cardinal McCarrick for many years, he's treading water. He's playing for time. He's waiting till things calm down. And then he's going to proceed to get right back to what he had been doing, which was inserting himself into a whole lot of things that were really not his business. And in his newly retired state, setting himself up as a kind of parallel foreign minister of the Vatican. Some of that may have been at the request of the Holy See. I suspect that most of it was self-initiated.
And then trying to ingratiate himself with Paroline and Francis.
And then the superiors simply shrug and go along with it. I said in the Catholic World Report piece I published yesterday about my little cameo role in this.
Oh yes, which we're going to get to. Don't ruin it, George.
And other aspects of this, that what this reveals, I think publicly, is what many of us had known for a long time. This man was a relentless self-promoter. He was an extraordinary sycophant with superiors he thought could help him.
And the wealthy.
And he was quite shameless about pushing himself into matters that were of some interest to him, whether that was China or the Church and Islam or whatever. Now, when we roll the videotape back a few years, I would like to know if there is going to be any release of the full letter that Cardinal Ratzinger sent to the bishops of the United States at their June 2004 meeting on the matter of Catholic politicians who were off the reservation badly on the abortion issue, presenting themselves for Holy Communion. McCarrick redacted that letter and read only parts of it to the bishop at the June meeting. I think it'd be very instructive to see the whole letter.
Well, there's an interesting tie-in. I'm going to ask this question, but don't forget that, because there's a link here. An October 7th, 2008 email from McCarrick to Figueredo further clarifies the restrictions he was operating under. He writes, Cardinal Ray has approved my moving to a parish, and my Archbishop Wuerl has been great in beginning to work that out. I've agreed to make no public appearances, either here or abroad, without the permission, and resign from all Roman and USCCB entities. Cardinal Ray has also forbidden me to come to Rome. Now, the note also indicates that the original letter is going from the nuncio to Ray in the pouch, the diplomatic pouch. 2 days later, in an email to Figueredo, McCarrick writes, I've sent the copy directly to Archbishop Wuerl. Now, this seems to prove that Cardinal Wuerl had some knowledge, complete knowledge, of these restrictions and the penalties. My question is, what impact will this have on Wuerl's credibility, firstly?
I think this is very sad, actually. In many respects, Cardinal Wuerl was a very fine Archbishop of Washington, and he deserves credit for being that. I cannot understand why he has taken the position he has on the McCarrick business since it first broke a year ago. And it does now seem quite clear that he was aware, whether he now recalls that or not, that he was aware of what was going on. But at a certain point, Raymond, the buck has to stop at the Holy See. If it was the Holy See that was saying, we want you to stay at home, pray, be a good emeritus bishop, and just get out of public limelight. It's up to the Holy See to enforce that, and that means it's up to the nuncio to enforce that. It's up to the Cardinal Secretary of State, of course, Tarcisio Bertone at that time. There was a real failure of follow-through on this by people who should have understood that if you didn't put something equivalent to an electronic lock on this man's leg,
it was going to lead to more problems
he was
for the
going
church.
to go and keep doing his thing.
Now, this also speaks to, and you mentioned that letter, that infamous letter that then Pope Benedict writes about the reception of communion for politicians who are departing from church teaching on life. At the time, McCarrick indeed had custody of that letter. The president of the Bishops' Conference at that time was the new Archbishop of Washington, Wilton Gregory. What pressure is there now on Gregory, given that he's promised to be transparent, to become forthcoming with the letters and documents that might be in the Washington archives now?
I don't know what's in the Washington archives. Archbishop Gregory is a very competent man who I think did the church a very good service during the first abuse crisis in 2002. He knows that he's got a big problem of trust here in the Archdiocese of Washington. But as we go forward on this, rather important question of, is the reception of Holy Communion by people who are involved in what is now not just bordering on infanticide, but in the case of several recently passed state laws, is infanticide, that it would be very good to know what Cardinal Ratzinger had written in 2004 on that.
Yeah. I want to move on to a letter from September 1st, 2008. Now, this is McCarrick writing to Tarcisio Bertone, the Vatican Secretary of State, and he offers him an account of his behaviors in light of the restrictions that Ray wrote him about. He says this, I do recognize that in one particular case, I had been at fault in an unfortunate lack of judgment. I've always considered my priests and seminarians as part of my family, and just as I've shared a bed with my cousins and uncles and other relatives without thinking of it being wrong, I had done this on occasion when the diocesan summer house was overcrowded. In no case were there minors involved, but men in their 20s and 30s. And he goes on, I'm not going to, but he goes on to deny any wrongdoing. He said he never had sexual relations with anybody. Now, we now know for certain that this is not true. He abused adults, he abused minors. Doesn't this prove that the Vatican also knew he was at least sharing beds with seminarians, and everybody just looked the other way?
Yeah, it's a very disturbing letter, both in his either manifest incomprehension.
Oh my gosh! I don't know about you, but I haven't shared beds with cousins or uncles. Certainly doesn't
that
adult
part
man.
of my family life. And yeah, I mean, look, if you are Cardinal Bertone and you get that letter, you are on the phone to the nuncio in the next hour and saying, we want these sanctions enforced. This is a bomb waiting to go off. We don't know that this man is not engaging in untoward behavior now, and we want him under some form of control. Look, if he had been remanded to a religious house, as he was after he lost
Eventually,
the red hat, a lot of trouble would have been saved.
Now, but why confess to a lack of judgment, of the sharing the bed and all of this to Bertone? It is bizarre.
It's spin. It's spin.
Buying for, as you said earlier, buying time.
No, I mean, look, here's the reality of the beach house, the diocesan beach house, as he's describing it. Rumors about all of that had been going around for years, but no one had ever come forward and said, this happened to me on such and such a date in this place, and I'm willing to stake my reputation on that.
Right.
So at least in those days, if no one was willing to come forward and lay a serious accusation and put their own reputation on the line, you just hoped it was a bunch of stories.
Yeah.
But there were so many of them.
Oh, there were tons of them.
That it now seems very clear, as it was from the settlements that were reached in Newark and Metuchen, that there were real problems here that frankly went unaddressed.
Whatever happened in 2007 or in 2008, it's clear from this new correspondence dump that by 2013, McCarrick was up and running again. He writes about traveling a good deal, that in the next week he's going to be in Cyprus and the Balkans and the Middle East, Lebanon, the Holy Land. And then he says he's put off his return to China. He'll make sure he speaks with Archbishop Parolin before the next time. My question is, you have him coordinating and really a part of this negotiation with China on some level. Does that disturb you, given the deal that was finally come to?
Knowing Cardinal McCarrick, the former Cardinal McCarrick, as I do, it is entirely possible that he was doing all of this on his own wicket. Be nice to know who paid for all of this travel.
Exactly.
That would be an interesting point. And that he was simply attempting to play along with the superiors in Rome and try to say, look, I'm really conducting a parallel channel for you guys here. This is all helpful and whatnot. Now, the question is, why didn't they say to him, then Archbishop Parolin, later Cardinal Parolin, stop it. We don't want you doing this. Now, the deal, as I have written and we have, I believe, discussed here, is a terrible deal.
Horrible.
Never should have been made, is looking even worse
as
6 to 8 months out, as China continues its brutal persecution of religious groups. Whether McCarrick had anything to do with defining that, I frankly doubt, in the sense that this was the deal that John Paul II could have had. It's the deal that Benedict XVI could have had, and they both said, no, we're not going to let the state, or now the Chinese Communist Party, nominate bishops. So, you know, McCarrick's claim to be in the loop on this stuff
may or may not be true.
Should be taken with the same large salt shaker, not grain of salt, as his claim in that infamous Villanova lecture to have kind of wired the conclave. Of 2013, during which one of his brother cardinals told me, we're duct taping his mouth. He was getting so out of control within the discussions of the American cardinals that the cardinal in question said to me, we're going to have to duct tape it.
Wow. Now, there's a moment here in this new document dump where a certain George Weigel appears. Your big moment. I want to read this. In January 27th of 2017, in a letter to Pope Francis, McCarrick mentions rumors that the Trump administration might be considering naming George Weigel to the role of ambassador to the Holy See. The letter reads, there were rumors here in Washington that the new U.S. government had submitted a request for an agreement for a new U.S. ambassador to the Holy See. One of the names that was mentioned was that of George Weigel. He is very much a leader of the ultra-conservative wing of the Catholic Church in the United States and has been publicly critical of Your Holiness in the past. Many of us American bishops would have great concerns about his being named to such a position in which he would have an official voice in opposition to your teaching. I would be happy to discuss this with you and also with the high officials of the Curia. Your reaction to this?
Well, it's all rubbish and nonsense. First of all, on January 17th, I think was the date of that letter, the Trump administration had not even been inaugurated.
Right.
So the notion that they had reached out to the Holy See for an agrément on a new ambassador is absurd on the face of it. Secondly, where I think
so you were not offered the post?
I wasn't interested in it and wouldn't have accepted it if it had been offered because I have other things to do. Secondly, I think where McCarrick picked this up, or one of his minions picked it up, was in a squib in Vatican Insider by the British journalist Christopher Lamb on January 13th. In which he went through a number of plausible candidates and then threw in at the end wild cards who included Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bill O'Reilly, and me.
George Weigel.
So I know Chris Lamb, so I sent him an email and I said, look, I could have saved you a lot of trouble. If you'd asked me about this, I'm not interested. I wouldn't have accepted it. He wrote back sort of apologizing for doing this without asking whether there was anything to it. So, look, if McCarrick was so out of it that he imagined that I, who, as you remember, had been quite critical of
Donald Trump,
of the Trump candidacy, was a candidate, that says he was really losing it. But I don't think that's the case. I think he took this squib in Vatican Insider as a way to backstab me with the Pope. He was probably unhappy that I had had 2 private audiences with the Holy Father at that point. So he decided to put the knife in. Moreover, it is simply a lie that I had been publicly critical of the Pope. I had written things questioning this, that, or the other aspect of the pontificate, including the China deal.
Right.
But I had always done this in a way respectful of the Pope himself. That was simply malicious backstabbing. It's not unexpected.
No.
We had not been on the same page for
a long
20 years. But it's really almost pathetic that this man would descend to this kind of calumny, this kind of lying, in order to do in someone who had been a member of his archdiocese for 6 years, and with whom he had always pretended in public to be very, very jolly and friendly and avuncular and whatnot. So it's all a lot of nonsense.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of that in the church. Really. You get the smiles in the back clapping, and then you leave the room, and
hopefully
the scene
that
changes.
is changing over
I hope.
time. But this was particularly unfortunate. And I frankly, the first thing I did when I saw it was laugh out loud. Fortunately, I had saved all the correspondence with Chris Lamb.
So you have the backup, corroborating evidence. Now, Monsignor Figueredo, who was then McCarrick's secretary for a limited period of time, and then kind of an adjunct aide in Rome for him, he claims he came forward and dumped these documents stemming from the Pope's new sex abuse guidelines, which says, if you know something, say something. Everybody has an obligation to report. Does that wash with you? I
have known Monsignor Figueredo for probably 20 years. I'd like to think we're friends. I hope he thinks of me as one. I had no knowledge that he was, before this dump, saving these materials. I did hear a month before the dump that this was likely, and I invited the person who told me to invite him to call me to talk about whether this was a good idea, if he wanted to, which he did not. So I can't speculate on his motives. I do think he is genuinely upset at the kind of stonewalling that's going on about this, which does not serve the interests of the Church, does not serve the credibility of the hierarchy, does not serve the credibility of the Holy See.
Well, as I mentioned to Cardinal Burke, there is a commitment. The Vatican came out and said, we're going through all the documentation. What kind of pressure, vis-a-vis the McCarrick situation, does the Vigano revelations, as well as now the Figueredo report, place on the Vatican and U.S. church officials?
Well, the Vatican is very good at playing a long game, so I wouldn't want to speculate on that. I don't know, Raymond, that there is a lot of revelatory paper to be uncovered here. McCarrick's rise to Newark, his translation to Washington, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of paper on that. That was undoubtedly done backstage and whatnot. I do think it's interesting that he had left this paper trail.
Right. All over the place.
Essentially implicating himself in all sorts of strange and wondrous things. So there may be a lot more of that, and in fact, I think if you read Monsignor Figueredo's statement, he says there is more, and we'll see whether it comes out. But I'm not persuaded that there is some thick file of stuff related to Newark and Washington. Now, what there is what Archbishop Vigano says he informed Pope Francis. The file in the Congregation for Bishops.
And that has yet to be.
And I don't know that doesn't include material of a quasi-confessional sort. I don't know. But that is certainly there.
I want to pick up on that point. Vigano's contention that he told the Pope in June of 2013 about this. In his first direct comments about the McCarrick case, Pope Francis in an interview told a Mexican journalist this: I knew nothing, obviously nothing. I said it many times. I knew nothing. I had no idea about McCarrick. When he says that, he spoke to me the day, June 23rd, 2013, that he came. I don't remember if he told me about this. Whether it's true or not, no idea. But you know that I didn't know anything about McCarrick. Otherwise, I wouldn't have kept quiet, right? Your reaction?
I think there's an obligation and justice to try to construe the Pope's rather rambling remarks in the most positive light. And that is that he didn't take Archbishop Vigano's strong suggestion that he call Cardinal Wuerl, the prefect of the Congregation for Bishops, and said, let me have the file on Cardinal McCarrick. I mean, that's the best construction you can put on this. As we discussed at the time of the first Vigano testimony, which is not without some problems, but on this key point, Archbishop Vigano has told me that same account 3 different times. Once shortly after it happened, twice some years after that. I cannot believe that he is
fabricating that.
Up. And more to the point, and I want to underscore this as I did in my Catholic Report article yesterday, which perhaps you can post on your website.
We'll put it up on Facebook.
The notion that Archbishop Vigano's testimonies, because there are now 3
multiples,
of these, have been concocted by wealthy Americans who dislike the Pope because of his view of markets and immigration, is absolute rubbish and poppycock. That is not true, and yet it is widely believed in circles around Pope Francis. I have no idea whether the Pope believes it or not. And it is being sold to other leaders of the world church. I ran into this during the Synod of 2018, last October. I ran into it during the Abuse Summit in February. This is a law, and it's being used both to undercut the church in the United States, and as I said in the article yesterday, it's being used to frame the debate prior to the next conclave. And this must stop. And it needs to be confronted. And frankly, the American bishops
have to be more vocal.
Need to push back on this.
Yeah.
Because they know it's a law.
Yeah, no, I mean, you read these conspiracy theories in some of these magazines from Rome, and your head explodes. You know, one wonders, where was this organization? If such an organization exists, where is it? It doesn't seem to be very effective if it's in place.
Well, Raymond, this is the kind of rubbish that people who know they're losing an argument engage in.
Resort to.
When you cannot meet the arguments of the legitimate critics of some aspects of this pontificate, and there are illegitimate critics. Let's stipulate that. Some people have gone completely bonkers.
Cuckoo, yeah.
But if you cannot meet the legitimate queries, much less criticisms, what do? You resort to this kind of conspiracy mongering, and it is absolutely unbecoming to anyone who thinks of themselves as a churchman.
I want to move on to this new draft. It's a new constitution for the Curia. No one's watched the Vatican closer than you, George, over many decades. Your thoughts on where this will take us? Some say, look, we're opening the windows, the laity's being more involved. Your take. What does it really
I've read the draft Apostolic Constitution. I have no idea whether it's going to be issued on June 29th, which is the rumor of the day. It is absolute nightmare.
Really?
It's self-referentially inconsistent throughout. The first part of it has nothing to do with much of anything except a lot of verbiage. There is a very serious undercutting, I believe, of what we now know as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is told that when it's when there's a contentious matter with other dicasteries, these will be settled by dialogue. No, I mean, unless CDF is the bottom line on doctrine, there is no bottom line on doctrine. And at least as I read it, I would leave canonists and others who are more familiar with that stuff to make the final judgment. But as I read it, this really guts the Secretariat for the Economy and pretty well dismantles a lot of what Cardinal Pell had put in place in his years in Rome. It's really a terrible piece of work. It's very, very shoddy. As Cardinal Mueller has said, it's theologically illiterate. So I hope there is enough pushback from the world episcopate that they take a deep breath over there and say, all right, we've got to try this.
Because this new this evangelism dicastery would sort of loom large over everything and diminish the role of the congregation.
Well, it's very unclear what this dicastery for evangelization is supposed to do.
Right.
The fact that it's listed first, I don't know what that means. I think there's probably a bit of hysteria about that. But if you actually read the document, it's very unclear what it is. The thing on CDF, what we now know as CDF, is unbelievable. It's as if this congregation were the Catholic Theological Society of America or an academic seminar instead of the bottom line of the integrity of Catholic faith and belief. So it's a big mess. It's essentially not fixable. I have sent friendly bishops a list of what I consider absolute bottom line things that cannot stay in this if the intention is to push it through. But my frank hope is that it's back to the drawing boards, because this is a real Edsel here.
Yeah, no, it's a nightmare.
I mean, it's an Edsel, and it isn't going to.
You mentioned Cardinal George Pell, who was convicted in March of sexual abuse against 2 minors. Really on the word of just one person, with no corroborating evidence beyond that, according to reports and those who were in the room and watched the trial closely. He is appealing this next week. Give me your thoughts on where we are here and what reasonable he can expect. What is reasonable?
Well, the appeal will be heard by a 3-judge panel on June 5th and 6th, and then they will go make up their minds. whether this verdict was what is called in Australia an unsafe verdict, which means the jury could not have rationally come to this conclusion. That is absolutely the case. So as I have been saying in my own writing and media commentary on this, what's really on trial right now is the Australian justice system. If this verdict is not quashed, when it is manifestly a false and wicked verdict, then people are going to really have to wonder, is it safe to travel to Australia? Is it safe to do business in Australia? Is there any rule of law in Australia? So we'll see. I think the case for quashing the verdict and exonerating the cardinal is so overwhelming that I cannot see how 3 senior jurists, presumably men of probity and experience, can possibly do anything else but quash this. However, the public atmosphere remains completely toxic.
Right.
So we'll see.
And you've got major media figures who've written books about this and are writing books, and they're doing documentaries.
Paid for by the Australian government. The fact that one of the chief persecutors of Cardinal Pell, Louise Milligan, works for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation is scandalous. This is absolutely scandalous. Her book was totally shredded by Julia Yost at First Things a couple of years ago. But this is absolutely scandalous. That she's on the government payroll, this is the government TV, and continuing to do this. What is going on here?
Well, and then there was a report that Pell would not, if he loses this appeal, he would not ask for an abbreviated sentence. Edward Penton is reporting today, talking to those close to Pell, that he and his lawyers have made no determination about this at all.
I am in regular touch with all of the principals in this, and that's not true.
Well, we'll leave it there. George
Thank
Weigel, thank you for being here. The book, The Fragility of Order, Catholic Reflections on Turbulent Times, and the most recent work by George Weigel, and his forthcoming book, The Irony of Modern Catholic History, is forthcoming in September.
September 7th.
So you can get that in the days ahead. George, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Raymond.
And summer reading season has arrived. Will Wilder 3, The Amulet of Power, and the rest of the series is available at bookstores everywhere and online, also at the EWTN Religious Catalog. By the way, this being Joan of Arc's feast day, the helmet of Joan of Arc figures prominently in the latest book, The Amulet of Power. Get it this summer. That's all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, you can follow me on Twitter. The links are RaymondArroyo.com. Be sure to catch us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.